I am ready to go. So pleasure to be here, and thanks everyone for making time to join this incredible event. Big shout out to Connor and team for putting this together. This has been incredible so far. I'm presenting some slides here, which are going to cover some of the topics I was asked to get into around figuring out what are the precedents that we can use to help guide the next steps for decentralized governance. As a little bit about myself, I'm a fellow at the Stanford Center for Blockchain Research, and I'm also the director of the newly established Starling Lab, which is at Stanford and at USC, which is using decentralized ledger technology to advance human rights. In my capacity here, I'm going to talk about 2 years worth of research that I've done on decentralized governance, and specifically looking at the history of certain models in open source and also in cooperatives, and how they can help guide the future. So first of all, let's just give ourselves some context. Where are we at this moment in time? There's no question that we're at a moment of tremendous innovation with the corporate form. And if you look at what DAOs have done, they've unlocked discussions that have really been needing to happen for quite some time. And what we're trying to do collectively is to get out of the orbit of shareholder capitalism and a lot of the troubles that have existed with applying that model to internet native businesses. And by doing that, we hope to achieve this escape velocity to basically get out of that orbit. So the question then is, if I'm going to succeed today, is how can we maintain the enthusiasm and the rate of innovation, but at the same time face some sober realities about some of the promises that we're making, and make sure that we take adequate steps to fulfill those promises. So let's go ahead and begin and think about what some of those functions that DAOs are hoping to accomplish might look like. We've seen essentially, as everyone's talked about many times over, this progressive steps of decentralization that have really followed the unfolding set of functions that DAOs are now handling. So anything from protocol development and incentivization to now, like as we're seeing people wanting to push into DAOs the entire management and governance of a protocol in a more way. And then finally, as kind of a callback to 2015, we're now seeing DAOs focusing on how to pool resources and make investments. So kind of making good on the finally on the original promise of DAOs. So if we take these functions, we can split them elegantly into two types of precedents. One is that we can look at how open source technologies can help with certain things that are quite familiar, actually, that they've handled, the DAOs aren't getting into with development and incentivization. And then finally, we can look at the corporate form and how that can inform the types of things that DAOs are trying to do. And that's where cooperatives can be quite useful. So let's begin with open source. In many ways, if you go back to where open source began in the late 90s, now we have over 20 years of experience with open source communities. It's a miracle. What Netscape did is a Hail Mary to go and fight Microsoft for basically the future of the internet, succeeded beyond everyone's wildest dreams. It didn't just defend the model of engagement on the internet and saved it from centralized corporate control, which is ultimately what Microsoft wanted. But instead, it really unlocked a whole paradigm of development. And really, if you think about the economic impact of it, it is tremendous. And here are some stats from the EU to show really what the power is of open source. And I don't need to convince anyone here that this works, because basically all DAOs are premised on the idea that their code is open source so that it can be auditable and you can create these trustless systems. So if we look at the success of open source, one of the things that we can find is that actually there has been a tremendous amount of organization that has emerged over these 20 years for organizing open source communities. And if you go to Mozilla's website, I highly advocate for people to check out the open source archetypes document. This thing is really an incredible document that explains how open source communities work, what are their goals, how do they form, and the governance that's there. You can see here in the quick reference, like there's this awesome level of depth, and there's some really practical tools that people can use to say, okay, how could we base certain DAO functions and DAO activities on the wealth of management and governance practices that have evolved over the last 20 years with open source. But I want to focus on the realities, which is that, at least from an open source standpoint, because it's generally speaking a non-for-profit activity and it's not automated yet, in the way that DAOs are, these are entirely human-driven processes for the most part, and therefore they're vulnerable. If you look at things like the Heartbleed bug, I mean, it was a moment where it almost brought the internet to its knees because so many people were dependent on open source software there, and you had to find somebody who was on a boat in the middle of the Netherlands in order to go and have them properly update the code. And now we're still dealing with zombie legacy issues from that bug. So it shows the vulnerability of human processes. We also have seen in the last 20 years that open source works in terms of development, but also the maintenance of open source communities. Generally speaking, the larger and more successful organizations still rely on major corporates to work and to fund their efforts. And that doesn't exactly feel right in terms of where DAOs want to head. And so, that reality is there. There's many reasons, but chief among them is that open source in its formation sought to embrace Fortune 500 companies. Finally, if you look at the results of what open source communities have developed in terms of code, there's been a tremendous successes, but then a lot of the problems that we're seeing with the Web 2.0 that I'm highlighting here, I mean, those specifically came out of advancements that came through open source development. So it's not to say that open source can't solve these things, but it is a reality that these things will not solve themselves. Decentralization and just making something open source doesn't inherently make it more resilient and can deal with these matters. And probably the most difficult thing here is that there's an assumption that's made, which is that with open source technology, open access, which anyone can have, doesn't necessarily yield inclusion. And the stats really bear this out when you look at who develops open source code. The challenge here is that open source, while incredible, is still very much based as an activity that is for predominantly males who are young to do their work. And when you think about that, especially in the last year, as we've all started to look at systemic racism more seriously, it's clear that open source is a long way to go in order to manage a lot of these problems with inclusion. So what are some of those solutions? Well, surely, because we're all here for DAOs, we're excited about the new incentives that you can create with things like tokens that can potentially help get out of the nonprofit incentives that open source communities have developed and now into maybe for-profit activities and more formalized forms of governance. So it's in there that you need a better corporate form, and that's where we get to cooperatives. So let's talk a little bit about DAOs, where they sit. Initially, DAOs, if you follow the progressive decentralization model, they typically emerge from for-profit companies that then place activities into nonprofit foundations. And DAOs, in a way, are really something in between all of these things. They are for-purpose entities, which is exactly what cooperatives are. They share in their DNA, they're very much of the same value. And so when you think about, as we really want DAOs to consider their legal standing and potentially to formalize and to get out of that gray area where unregistered and unformalized DAOs are essentially going to be liable and classified as default partnerships. If you want to avoid all of that and get corporate benefits, then really cooperatives are a really good candidate for a corporate form. And so the key design features that I think are the most appealing for DAOs are this idea that the rewards in cooperatives are awarded based on this concept of patronage. The more you use a cooperative, the more you get to share in its success. And secondly, cooperatives don't aim to necessarily maximize a return on equity. They aim to maximize benefits or to maximize purpose. And that's because the owners of a cooperative are both the consumers as well as the shareholders. And there's a regenerative and a virtuous way to think about that type of ownership, because that means that you don't just want something to give a return on equity in let's say, a dollar value or token value, but it means that if you're actually using the product, you want it to be awesome and you want it to continue to be awesome. Or if it's community, you want it to have values and to continue to espouse those values. So the good news with cooperatives is that they are actually quite a sturdy and hardened form of corporate entity. There's over 200 years of corporate history with cooperatives. A really good example when you look at, to really crystallize why they're so powerful, is how cooperatives were actually the dominant form of corporation back in the late 1700s. And you look at the numbers, and it's quite staggering that 1/5 of all US corporate charters in the United States in the late 1700s were actually with turnpikes, which are, I would say, the blockchains and tokens are really, if you think of them as infrastructure and essentially new infrastructure for a new economy, turnpikes were very much the same thing there. It was infrastructure for a young country. And so why I, as a business member, bought into a cooperative for a turnpike is because I wanted access to a road. And secondly, I want to make sure that my competitors couldn't force me out of it. So the real logic of cooperatives is that at their core, they have an incredible amount of success in dealing with antitrust matters. And I'll bury this here and come back to it later, the way that works is that you make sure that each member of the cooperative has a share, and by that, one vote, as opposed to the traditional model of corporations today, which, one member has one vote in a cooperative versus the traditional model in corporations today, where one share equals one vote. And that's a major distinction. Okay, where are cooperatives? They are everywhere in the economy. Sometimes they're noted as a cooperative, like REI, which many people might be a member of. In Europe and the UK and Japan, these are dominant forms of retail and healthcare and banking institutions. There's also many other examples. My favorite probably is that the New York Stock Exchange at its inception and for many decades was actually operated as a cooperative. So when you look at how could we use these for DAOs, I think that the first thing to acknowledge is that there are many challenges with traditional cooperatives. So if you look at your typical T Corp or LCA, there are a number of different restrictions that are quite onerous. Caps on dividends and limitations essentially on how you move shares around, they're not going to fly for DAOs. That's just a fact. And in particular, the way in which you do capital allocation, especially in light of what was just previously discussed with treasury diversification, a lot of the requirements there are liquidity requirements and are just not going to work. And the tax liabilities that come with some of these responsibilities are enormous. And so they're not necessarily the most tax efficient entity. So the more modern form of cooperatives, which most people should be looking at, is the Wyoming hybrid cooperative model, which was acted in 2001. And interestingly, what this allowed is for the commingling of members of a cooperative that were both holding common shares that were classified not as securities, and then third-party investment members that were holding preferred shares that are securities. And that's incredible, because that's actually what you want with a DAO to an extent, is you want to be able to delineate, you have a safe zone for people to operate with shares that are not securities. And then if you still want to do things like capital formation, you can do that as well with securities. The Wyoming DAO law, which a lot of people have talked about, which launches tomorrow, is certainly a very interesting step in the right direction. And when we think about all the innovations that are to come with the HR and collaboration mechanisms like joint ventures and even the autonomous proposals idea, those are incredible. And there's no question that they're going to be able to take flight with these new tools and corporate structures. But there's a little bit of a fallacy here, and I want to explain, which is that the Wyoming bill, while in theory it could work really well and could proliferate, the reality is that there's many things that could come in to create trouble with that if the members of the organization are not well thinking about these problems in advance. So as an example, not all DAOs are necessarily willing to embrace open source ideals. When we've taken that as a truth, but actually there's been some new proposals that have thought a little bit how we can create IP regimes. I'm not weighing in whether those are good or bad, but there's a reality, which is that cooperatives themselves or DAOs themselves really do need to think about their values. And secondly, the decentralization that comes with cooperatives doesn't always necessarily yield what we want. The AP is held up as an example of a cooperative, which is made up of thousands of newspapers and media organizations. And indeed, it's been an incredible asset in creating objective and reliable news for almost 2 centuries. But its current form as a cooperative, while it's very appealing, and we might even think of like applying it to things like Twitter, which has been proposed, the reality is that that's come through a series of very challenging court cases. in which actually it was found that the cooperative was violating various antitrust laws. And the AP went rogue and actually started to play a cat and mouse game with different courts to continue to evade essentially accountability. So just to emphasize here that accountability is still really important because DAOs could yet run amok. So let me leave here very quickly with some lessons for DAOs. One, if it isn't been clear from the lessons from the open source community, we need to think about diversity and embedded values proactively. This should not be an afterthought. The history of co-ops has shown that they've been incredibly important for the civil rights movement, and it urged people to look at that history as a really good model of how we can embed values. Second, once we get the issues, past the issues of liability, taxation are really going to, those issues are going to be a major fulcrum for adoption. And look no further than the example of LLCs. Although LLC laws were passed in 1977, it wasn't until 1988 that the IRS actually ruled on how they would tax, and it was only after that that LLCs became such a dominant form of corporate form. So we need DAOs to figure out their tax model. And finally, I think it's worth looking at ways in which voting could potentially be to inherit some of the logic that comes from cooperatives with the one member and one vote strategy, because that ultimately will create self-fulfilling prophecies around inclusion. So with that, I will yield the floor back to the rest of the panelists. I hope these ideas have been helpful. And as I said, if I've been successful, everyone remains optimistic about the future of DAOs and hope that these tips and tools can help us evolve them to their next stage. Thanks so much.